In case anyone is wondering why this begins late, it's because Senator Ayotte was late getting here. I thought you might want to know that.
Never a good place to be with Senator McCain.
This morning we're here to discuss our plan to replace the first year of cuts, both defense and non-defense, required by sequestration with common sense reductions in federal spending. Our plan will provide savings through attrition, hiring 2 federal employees for every 3 that leave federal service, and extending the current federal employee pay freeze, which includes members of Congress, for an additional year and a half. This will allow us to be able to meet our constitutionally responsibility to protect and defend the nation. Let me be clear. I believe that the cuts that are required by sequestration aimed at the Department of Defense are a threat to our nation's security, and we are opposed to that draconian action, as is the Secretary of Defense and others. In fact, the Secretary of Defense has made as strong a statements as you could possibly expect. He says that facing large reductions, we'd have to reduce the size of the military sharply. Rough estimates suggest after 10 years, we would have the smallest ground force since 1940, the smallest number of ships since 1915, the smallest air force in history. It goes on and on. The Secretary of Defense said the impact of these cuts would be devastating for the department. That comes from the Secretary of Defense. We agree. And we find ourselves in this position today because the President of the United States has failed to show leadership. It's time for the President to lead and accept his responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief and work with us to enact a plan that will reduce our debt and maintain our military preparedness. In November, I wrote to Secretary of Defense Panetta, as I said, and he said it was devastating, unacceptable. Right now, already, the administration plans to cut $487 billion from the defense budget over the next 10 years. We are adjusting to that. We've had several briefings on the administration's plans for that. And those cuts don't include the impact of sequester. They already impose massive reductions in the size of our armed forces by slashing more than 100,000 troops over the next 5 years, including 80,000 active duty soldiers and 20,000 Marines. In addition, the Air Force would lose 10% of its tactical aviation squadrons. The Navy, which has struggled for decades to reach 313 combat ships, will retire 7 cruisers. Again, this is a common sense proposal. It is only 1 year. We have rushed to this decision because the Pentagon must begin planning now for what they're going to do next year. So if these cuts are enacted, they would have to plan on that at a very early occasion. Again, the President of the United States comment, the only one that I know of, is he said, well, he would only accept it if we, a reversal of the sequestration if we agreed to tax increases. Let's not let a domestic issue such as tax increase interfere with what could be devastating, in the words of our Secretary of Defense, to our nation's security. We still live in a very dangerous world. And everyone agrees that sequestration, this kind of sequestration, cannot take place. This is a proposal that we think has great validity, and we look forward to working with other members on both sides of the aisle, and especially the President of the United States. I ask the President of the United States today, step forward, sit down with us, let's negotiate out a plan that can maintain this nation's place in the world. Senator Cole.
Thank you, John. Just a couple of things to fill in some blanks. In order to be successful, this exercise will have to be bipartisan. And so we haven't just focused on defense, but we would raise the money this year enough to both avoid the sequester on defense as well as the non-defense discretionary spending, because we know a lot of our Democratic colleagues care a lot about that, as do we. So this would be the first year in a 10-year plan. Obviously, if we could agree to 2 or 3 years, that would be even better. But we thought we'd better start now. As Senator McCain said, the Pentagon is already beginning their planning for 2013. There's going to be a lot of wasted motion and energy if we have to go deep into this year before this legislation passes. So we told you just before we left here in December that we would introduce the legislation, and today we will introduce the legislation. As Senator McCain said, it achieves the savings that are needed for the first year. by a combination of attrition of federal employees. We would replace 2 out of every 3, which is what the Bowles-Simpson Commission recommended. We only reduce it to 5%. However, Bowles-Simpson said reduce it all the way to 10% of the workforce. So we only do half as much as Bowles-Simpson recommended there. And on the pay freeze, here again, we're simply extending something that the President himself instituted for federal employees, including members of Congress. The pay freeze under this legislation would go to the middle of 2014, and the attrition would continue until we reach that 5% level. Again, on attrition, the President suggests that's the way to reduce the federal workforce with the Department of Commerce, for example. And if we can do it in that department, we can surely do it in others. There's always a question of whether you count postal employees as federal employees. I think technically they're not, and if you don't count postal employees, we've had a 10% increase in federal employees. At the same time, in the private sector, we've had at least a 1% decrease in jobs. As you know, the private sector layoffs have been devastating to our people. So there clearly is a place to save some money here by attriting federal employees, by continuing the pay freeze. Just a note on that, in my state of Arizona, our state employees have gone 5 years without a pay increase. So we think federal employees who have, as you saw by the news stories yesterday, a much better package of benefits and on average a higher compensation level than people in the private sector can do their part to help us meet this important goal. And by the way, that applies to when we talk about the number of people on the federal payroll. Think about what's going to happen here with the reduction in spending that will occur to the military. A lot of the people who support the military in the civilian sector have been increased because of reductions in military, and that probably would continue. So there's a lot that can be done, and we've tried to attack this in the way that would achieve the best result, quickest, with bipartisan support, taking concepts the President himself has supported, and we hope that he will help us to get this done.
John? No, John.
Well, I want to congratulate and thank Senator McCain, Senator Kyle for leading this effort that we're all proud to join in. I think the premise of our efforts is that the mission ought to define the budget. The budget shouldn't define the mission. And of course, the most important thing that the federal government does is keep the American people safe, and we do that thanks to the service of our brave men and women in uniform all around the world. It's also important to note that so far the Defense Department, which represents less than 20% of the federal budget, has already sustained more than 50% of the deficit reduction efforts. And as you can see, we're very concerned about hollowing out the military, and in the words of Secretary Panetta, Senator McCain said, these cuts would be devastating. And let me just close on this thought. Secretary Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, reminded us that our record of predicting our next conflict as a nation since the Vietnam War was perfect. We were wrong 100% of the time. And so we need to be prepared for threats known and unknown. And making these sort of draconian cuts as a result of the sequester is the wrong way to go. And so I'm proud to support the efforts led by Senator McCain, Senator Kyle, to try to deal with this in a sensible way that I hope will meet with broad bipartisan support.
I want to thank Senator Kyle and Senator McCain for their leadership on this very important legislation. We have a fundamental duty to the American people as set forth in our Constitution to keep them safe. And national defense is the most important constitutional duty that we have. Secretary Panetta has been very, very clear about the impact of the sequestration on our national defense. He said just last week that it will inflict severe damage to our national defense for generations to come. In my view, allowing this sequestration to occur is one of the most dangerous and irresponsible political decisions that have been made around here in memory. So I'm calling on the President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief of this country, to join us in this effort to make sure that we don't go down this road and allow our national defense to be undermined, that we keep faith with our military and with the American people so that they will know that we will not let this happen, that we will keep them safe. Thank you.
To John from Arizona, well done. I think we're going to get a lot of bipartisan support to abandon the sequestration provisions in the debt ceiling legislation because they're unwise and, quite frankly, dangerous. To keep you awake, I'm going to read some quotes, and I want you to tell me who said this. It would decimate our defense. It would cripple us in terms of our ability to protect the country. It would result in hauling out of the force. It would terribly weaken our ability to respond to threats in the world. It's a ship without sailors. It's a brigade without bullets. It's an air wing without enough trained pilots. It's a paper tiger. In effect, it invites aggression. The hollow military doesn't happen by accident. It comes from poor stewardship and poor leadership. This isn't like the drawdowns in the past when the potential enemy was disabled, in some way rendered ineffective. We're still confronting a number of threats in the world. We'd be shooting ourselves in the head. It's a mistake we've made it time and time again in the 20th century, after World War I, after World War II, after Korea, after Vietnam, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's what our Secretary of Defense said about the effect of sequestration. Why would we do that in light of, he either needs to be fired because he's so off base, or we need to listen to him and fix the problem. And the truth is, no change to the Defense Department is going to affect the financial future of this country in a substantial way. You could take the whole Defense Department budget and take it off table and still not get us out of debt. But if you did that, if you gutted the Defense Department, not only would you not achieve financial solvency, which is the goal of everyone, you would render us ineffective to the threats that we face. So this is an ill-constructed idea, and to the President, who threatened to veto any effort to change sequestration. Not only should you take that back, you should lead the charge. You should send people from the White House to sit down with us, to get Democrats and Republicans in a room so we can find a way to avoid what your own Secretary of Defense has said would decimate our ability to protect ourselves against threats known and unknown. If the Congress doesn't get this right, instead of firing the soldiers, which would be the effect of this legislation, you should fire us.
How much money are you planning to save through this plan next year?
It's $102 billion. Excuse me, $109 billion, which is the 1/10 of the 10-year sequestration.
For both defense and domestic?
Yes.
In
Total.
2013?
And whoever else would like to comment, you've long said that you need to find alternatives to sequestration that is too painful. But in coming forth with the spending cuts, the savings that you're proposing, they have been and are at this point a non-starter with most Democrats. So the two-parter, why then come forward with these proposed cuts? And two, does that show just how difficult it is in finding the budget savings that are needed in order to avoid sequestration?
Well, to start with some Democrats, it's a starter, including the President of the United States, because he made the proposal that we could reduce the workforce. There is bipartisan support for a pay freeze. There are some that don't want it, but certainly there are many other Democrats that I know that want it. And we're not saying this is engraved in golden tablets. We are saying this is our proposal. The President has no proposal. Why don't, when this was just pointed out, when the Secretary of Defense says that it would be catastrophic and devastating, and yet his president is basically silent or says that he will veto a bill, I mean, that may be one of the more Orwellian experiences I've ever had in my many years here. So there is support on the Democrat side for both of these proposals, and we are willing to look at other proposals if they want to. But let's engage. Right now, the Secretary of Defense has to start planning on what he's going to do with our nation's defense next year. So we wait the end of this year with this kind of cut staring him in the face. I mean, it would be so disruptive that it would endanger our national security. You want, Lindsey?
Can I just, one thing? This is a moment for the Democratic and Republican Party to do something that needs to be done. You know, we're not going to use a millionaire tax to fix every problem around here. We have a problem with that because we think it's about jobs. If the Democrats have a problem with the way we're paying for this, surely to God, in a budget this big, we can find enough money to avoid decimating the Department of Defense and rendering our ability to defend ourselves obsolete. If we can't do this, 1.2 trillion wasn't that heavy of lift, but this is now a time for both parties to come together and fix something that it has to be fixed. This is not something it would be nice to do. This is a must do. And here's the question for the Congress. Do you see this as a must? Is the consequences described by Leon Panetta to our Defense Department real, or is he just talking off the top of his head? This is a test of both parties. If you think this is no big deal, sit on the sidelines and just think of pay-fors that will never happen. If you think it really is a big deal to avoid the effects on the Department of Defense, not only should the Democratic and Republican parties be meeting seriously about it, there should be a representative from the White House down here with us. And we should go in a room and not come out till we get this right.
Depending on officials, Senator Graham said that the objection to the millionaire's tax had to do with jobs. The pay for in the legislation you're going to introduce would also reduce the federal workforce costing jobs. Why are those jobs acceptable jobs to be lost?
Well, I'll let John.
Yeah. Remember, and I was tempted to respond to your question. Federal employees are under a pay freeze right now because President Obama made that decision. We simply extend that pay freeze to to middle of 2014. The Simpson-Bowles report, which was supported by Democrats, called for attriting 10% of the federal workforce. They knew that we could lose that many employees and still run the federal government. We're not laying anybody off. We're not proposing to fire anybody. We're simply saying as people retire or quit, go to another job in the private sector, or for whatever reason, they leave the federal workforce, we don't have to replace all of them. We can replace 2 out of every 3.
And the federal workforce has increased by 10% in the last 4 years. So basically, if you cut 10% of the federal workforce through attrition, you'd be back where we started. And I don't know of any American that believes that we need more federal workers in the workforce. Well, yeah, I do. Yeah. Members of the federal workforce. Go ahead.
You were on the super committee, Senator Graham.
That's why it failed.
I do nothing with it, so that may be the best.
Senator Graham just said that 1.2 trillion wasn't a heavy lift, but it was a heavy lift for the super committee. You guys crashed and burned, couldn't find the pay-fors. Why do you expect that this time will be any different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's the difference between trying to do 1.2, or actually the Joint Select Committee was trying to do 1.5 if we could, trying to do all of that at once versus doing it one bite at a time, 1 year at a time. And it's like you don't eat a steak in one bite. You know, you try to do bite-sized pieces of it, and so you can swallow it. And I think that if we start with those things that have strong support from the American people, I mean, I don't know of any of my constituents that wouldn't jump up and down if I said, by the way, I want to freeze my pay. I think they'd think that was a good idea, and the other bureaucrats here in Washington. So I really think that we can choose some things that were identified by the Joint Select Committee to do this for 1 year, $109.2 billion. Then we'll tackle the year after that. And I think we can get several years down the road with pretty good bipartisan agreement because the so-called pay-fors are out there. Now, when you get down to years 8, 9, and 10, it might be more difficult, but by then everything will have changed anyway. And I think we'll be on a road to understand that we have to finish the 10-year program, and we'll be able to find the savings for it. So this is a matter of doing the doable, which is absolutely necessary. It's not an option, as Lindsay said. And we think it's just it's the best way to try to achieve a result, to get something done.
Some officials seem to think they can find savings through another grant process, and many members of your party seem to be pushing against that. Can you speak about what
I think, but look, I think everything would be on the table. we have had a number of BRACs, as we know. And a lot of us don't think that we have remaining too many extra bases. Now, I think you could make an argument that the national labs, you could look at that, but we are willing to negotiate on something like that. But right now, as you know, we are still paying for and implementing the last BRAC. So,
I have serious questions that BRAC ever sees savings. And if you look at the GAO report about BRAC and what has been done, before we enter another BRAC round, I think we really need to do a cost-benefit analysis of whether we're really going to save any money. And I think it's very, very questionable. I don't think we should go forward with a BRAC round right now because of that. And it ends up being just as much of a political exercise. We say that BRAC's going to avoid the politics. Well, sometimes there's more politics to BRAC closures, in my view, and I've seen it up close and personal. So at the end of the day, if that's going to be the process, why are we doing it? We're doing it to save money, and past process have not demonstrated that we're going to save money through BRAC.
And we also would be glad to look at overseas basing, particularly since we are withdrawing from Europe, either rightly or wrongly.
Senator McCain, if I could ask you about Secretary Panetta's announcement yesterday on Afghanistan. First of all, could you comment on what you think about it? Were you aware at all that that transition was going to be announced?
And what was the final?
Were you aware that he was going to announce it?
Of course not. In fact, it took not only me by surprise, but our NATO allies by surprise as well. I don't think you can consider Secretary Panetta's comments without the other big story today, Taliban captives dispute U.S. view on Afghanistan war. That the Taliban believe that their own Hearts and Minds campaign is winning over Afghans and even converting a growing number of Afghan government officials and soldiers. Basically, quote, and this is from a U.S. military report, as you know, many Afghans are already bracing themselves for an eventual return of the Taliban. The report says the Afghan government continues to declare its willingness to fight, yet many of its personnel have secretly reached out to insurgents seeking long-term options in the event of a possible Taliban victory. The Taliban are telling their friends and enemies today, see, I told you the Americans were leaving. And we have the greatest example of that, of what's happening in Iraq today, because we could have left 20,000 troops behind as a residual force if we'd have done it right, and we didn't, and now Iraq is unraveling at the cost of 4,474 brave young Americans' lives. You want,
I think this is an important debate for the country to have. At the end of the day, the 2012 fighting season has been compromised by removing all surge forces in September rather than at the end of the year. The proposal submitted to President Obama by our military leaders never envisioned that all 30,000 surge forces would be withdrawn from Afghanistan by September. What does that mean on the ground? It means that the gains we've made in the South through the introduction of surge forces, the plan was to go to the east this year. If those 30,000 are not available, it makes it very difficult to go against the Akani network in the east. So now if you add to the mix that we're going to abandon our combat role in 2013, that means the 2013 fighting season has been compromised. And the transition plan envisioned surge forces available to the commander through 2012, combat roles going through 2014, then transition at the end of 2014. So this announcement has the effect of compromising 2 fighting seasons. It does embolden our enemies because it's unsure as to what we actually mean. The NATO, the head of NATO today, the political wing of NATO, said he thought we should stay to 2014. So I hope the administration will clear this up. The Taliban are growing in strength. I've been told by soldiers on the ground that they've come up with a program that if you don't like your local Taliban leader, they've got a phone number you can now call and have a grievance dispute. If the guy is too harsh, you can sit down with Taliban folks and try to get the guy in line. Actually, the military campaign of General Allen is working very well. The clearing part is going well, holding and building is being compromised. So what I would like to see is for us to one day negotiate with a small t Taliban. This is a Pashtun civil war. It has to come to an end through reconciliation and negotiation, but do it through strength. This administration is focused on leaving because of the November election. The world needs to be focused on winning, not just the United States. And how do you win against a radical Islamic insurgency? The good news is that about 80% of the people in Afghanistan do not want to go back under Taliban leadership. But if they're uncertain as to the outcome, they will hedge their bets. And I've heard from everybody I do business with in Afghanistan that the bet hedging is at an all-time high. And this has made it more difficult to get people off the sidelines, because put yourself in the shoes of someone confronting the Taliban. If there's any doubt as to how this thing comes out, you're going to do what's best for your family. Here's what we should be doing. We should be giving the military the full force and effect of the surge. We should be fully committed to fighting through 2014, fully committed to transitioning in 2014, and in my view, we should have a security agreement with the Afghan government at their request that would allow a political, military, economic relationship past 2014. And I envision an agreement where you would have 3 to 4 air bases left behind in Afghanistan with American air power, helicopters and special forces units that could be available to Afghan security forces as far as the eye can see. That way, the Taliban would be defeated militarily in perpetuity, because the security forces would have a military edge. You could do this with 15 or 20,000 American forces, and the Taliban would never come back. Then you sit down and negotiate. So this president, I think, is focused on the November election. He wants to tell the American people, I got us out of Iraq and Afghanistan. I hope our nominee for president will say, I want to get us out of Iraq and Afghanistan, but I want to do it in a way that we're stronger. We're not going to be judged by the day we left Afghanistan and Iraq. We're going to be judged by what we left behind. And I am with Senator McCain on this. The president got the ball inside the 10. We were marching toward a touchdown in Iraq. His decision to leave no troops behind or not work hard to make that happen has, in my view, created a fumble near the goal line that could be a disastrous result for our national security interest. Iran is the biggest winner of these policies. If you're in Pakistan and you hear the Americans are going to leave, why would you not keep helping the Taliban? If you're the Iranians and you see us leaving in Afghanistan ahead of schedule and completely leaving in Iraq, why would you think we have the resolve to do what's necessary to keep you from having a nuclear weapon? Good job, Mr. President, of killing bin Laden. Good job using the drones against terrorists on the border. Strategically, you're making mistakes for a generation here. This is a huge deal. I hope they will reconsider. If you follow through with this plan to shorten the fighting season in 2013, you're going to create a situation for failure.
Yeah.
Can I just follow up, just to be clear, so you were not made aware by the Pentagon that they were planning on trying to
course not.
the combat role in 2013?
Of course not. They don't communicate with us.
General Petraeus told the House Intelligence Committee this morning that this has always been the plan, that it would always include a transition period. He said Panetta's comments have been overanalyzed.
I hope he's right. That's not the story that I'm reading, and it's not the reaction that they are getting throughout the world. French left, you will see other countries leaving early. I predict it. We got to go.